Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thanks to all of my colleagues that are in the House for this debate today. I also want to begin by thanking those who are in attendance in the gallery today and who have been instrumental in pushing this bill forward and many others that have come before it. I'll quickly read them off. Danielle Dussablon, Scott McIntyre, Chris Hoffman, who was the Vice President of the OPP Association, Monty Visselmeyer, Stephen Reed, Chris Watson, Lawrence Walter, Leslie Codesy, Jonathan Martin, Don Smith, Danielle Latulippe Lamande, Priya Bates, Ken Marchinick, Lawrence Walter, Chris Jackal, and Greg Arnold. Speaker, these are among just a handful of folks in our community safety and corrections universe that have stood for a long time with their colleagues in advocating and demanding that this government support their colleagues when it comes time to address post-traumatic stress disorder and the conditions that bring about that in a person's workplace. Speaker, I want to also thank two of my colleagues specifically. The one sitting right in front of me, Sherry DeNovo from Parkdale High Park, and and my predecessor on the file, Jen French, from Oshawa. Speaker, they both in tandem have advocated for the changes that you'll hear about today for a long time and in various incarnations through this House. They are relentless, they understand the issue, and I think they've done a tremendous amount of work to bring us to where we are today, which is a point in time where I hope this House finally expands the definition, the scope of those who are covered under presumptive PTSD legislation. So what I'm going to do for the benefit of the members in the House, and I'm sure you've heard it over years and years, is I'm going to go through the who, the what, the where, the why, and the hows to get rid of any questions that may remain as to why this bill is so desperately necessary in our province. Speaker, the who are those who were left out of the original Bill 163 that expanded post-traumatic stress disorder benefits and presumptive benefits to those first responders in policing, in our firefighters and paramedics. There was a subset of that group that were explicitly removed or explicitly not put in to the original bill. And at that time, Speaker, you can go back into the Hansard and check. We advocated at committee to bring these folks that you'll hear about today into the fold, because we know that they are exposed to the exact same incidents and trauma in their day-to-day routines that everyone else is. Speaker, this is an opportunity for us in this House to right a wrong, to correct an injustice. And it doesn't happen very often where we get a second chance to do that. So I implore my colleagues to take this opportunity to do the right thing and to support this bill. So, Speaker, those who will be covered under the bill today through its expansion are those in our probation parole sectors, nurses, and police services personnel, including investigators, special investigators, bailiffs, and others who were excluded. Now, I'm not certain why they were excluded to begin with, but I can only imagine that this government is precluded to baby steps instead of actually going the full way and doing the right thing the first time. So, you know, here we are as New Democrats, and anyone that's watched the debate throughout the afternoon has heard 3 separate bills where New Democrats have proposed how to do the right thing, have pushed on how to do the right thing. At a time where folks in our communities are asking for action, we're right here doing it. This is action in motion. Speaker, a couple of facts for the benefit of members. 30% of the 154 probation officers in Ontario that were surveyed have been exposed to 4 or more primary traumatic events throughout the course of their work. Of those officers, 10% were assaulted, 69 were threatened, 19% received death threats. Speaker, Bill 163, of course, excluded the segments that I'm including in this bill today, but they cover predominantly female occupations in healthcare, such as nurses, and they provide and provides entitlement solely for first responders, male predominant occupations. That was Bill 163. We can remedy that today. We can ensure that there is protection in these sectors that are so desperately needed. We have to look at other jurisdictions around the country. In Manitoba, Bill 35 is called the Workers' Compensation Amendment Act, and it includes probation and parole officers. It actually covers everyone. And that's a step that we put forward as New Democrats that was denied at the committee stage throughout various, again, incarnations of this bill. So, Speaker, in crafting the bill, I relied heavily on the testimony of those who presented at committee during 163. And I'm going to refer to a couple of them right now. If you ever wanted to know why we needed to do this bill, it's right here in that testimony. And I can't believe at that moment those members who were in the committee that voted against the expansion did so. I don't know what your marching orders were at that time, but after hearing and reading this testimony, you can't help but understand the effects that the traumatic incidences have on people. It affects their family life. It affects their psyche. It is a trigger to other mental health issues. It affects their financial status. And these are things that we are obligated in this House to ensure we protect. When we ask people, when we ask our first responders to do the work that no one else could do, to see the things that none of us in this House wish to see, when we ask the best of us to protect the rest of us, then it is our obligation to ensure that we do everything that we can so that they go home with peace of mind and support should they come into mental health distress. That's what today's bill is all about. Speaker, from Erna Bujna of the Ontario Nurses Association, she spoke, she said, while ONA supports the government's effort to move forward with presumptive legislation for post-traumatic stress disorder, ONA must express our disappointment with the government for excluding frontline nurses from coverage under Bill 163. So right out from the outset, we heard that people in our front lines, on our front lines in our healthcare sector, couldn't imagine that they would have been excluded. And why? Why would they have been excluded, Speaker? One nurse, here's an example, and unfortunately you're going to have to hear some of these details. As an example of some of the incidences that we see in our hospitals, in our healthcare system, one nurse had her finger amputated in a violent assault by a patient. Another nurse, screaming for help, was dragged from the hospital out towards busy Toronto oncoming traffic, only to be saved by construction workers who heard her scream for help over their jackhammers. Those are called Code White, Speaker. And if you can imagine, the nurse that was assaulted in that incident applied for PTSD support through WSIB and was denied.
Shame.
Shame.
It is a shame. There are other examples, Speaker, where nurses were essentially kidnapped and held in a room by a patient, obviously suffering mental distress, and was told, locked in the room, was told by that individual, by that person, that they were going to take their clothes off, they were going to rape them, and then they were going to kill them. And this, they began by taking their clothes off. They began that process. They were going to beat them to death. And their colleagues, that nurse's colleagues, could not enter that room. Fortunately, someone did break into the room and intervened. That nurse never returned to work. There's no way we can expect anyone to be inflicted with that type of trauma and to return to a regular workload. But, Speaker, despite those challenges, some often do. Some are able to overcome the stresses of life. We heard from Danielle, who's here today. I want to thank Danielle for being here today. Thank you so much for your advocacy. Thank you. I'm looking for... Danielle talks about about those in probation and parole dealing with violent sex offenders, having been threatened, having been followed, having to deal with people that obviously are, without hope day after day, and being able to overcome that, but actually feeling fortunate, actually having been feeling that she's a fortunate one to have not yet succumbed to what could be PTSD symptoms. But she understands that for the sake of her colleagues, this has to be here. The supports that are currently offered within the Ministry of Corrections are inadequate. They aren't there. They are often required to be triggered by management who don't feel as though that they need to do that. The workloads that probation parole officers are currently under are unmanageable. This provides stress not only in their daily working lives, but in their family lives, compounded by the nature of that work, Speaker. The fact that you are dealing with essentially the worst of society day in and day out, and we are asking them to do that without the protection of acknowledging that they are vulnerable to mental health issues. This bill will provide that protection, will ensure that we can't question whether that trauma of those crises that they deal with each and every day, that we will never question that was incurred under work, because we ask them to do that. We ask them to be brave in the face of so much tragedy each and every day. It is a simple step for us in this House to make that step. It will take some courage on the part of the government to do so after years of neglecting, but here's another opportunity to do the right thing and to expand those benefits to those that support us each and every day in our communities. Thank you, Speaker.